Please be sure to join the Passive Income Posse by clicking that subscribe button below. Super excited for today's episode. Joining me all the way from the great state of Texas is Brian. Please go ahead and give yourself an introduction.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dave. My name is Brian. Like Dave said, I'm from Houston, Texas, and I am a background in oil and gas. So I've been in the oil and gas industry for over 15 years, and I've got kind of a unique perspective on the industry in that I've been in the upstream, the downstream, and the midstream parts of the industry, as well as I was a crude oil trader for a number of years. So I've got kind of a bigger picture perspective on how the industry works as a whole. So that's kind of allowed me to use my expertise to invest in oil and gas companies. So I'm very energy specific as far as most of my income, passive income, and that's where a lot of my investments focus. But I'm always open to learn, and I'm actually in the process of writing a book right now. I actually just finished my first draft. Signed with a publishing company in April of this year, and so it's explaining the streams and what it all means and how to invest in oil and gas companies. So working on that the last few months, and really excited to get that finished up and off my plate too.
Wow, that's awesome. That opens up a few things. We'll have to have you come back on once the book is out and we can promote the book for you.
I'd love to.
Yeah, definitely. So it makes sense though. Texas obviously is a state very well known for oil and gas, the oil and gas industry. So I'm guessing that's sort of how you got into it, just by being near it, right? Like
absolutely. Houston's the oil mecca of the United States. I mean, it's everything oil and gas in Houston. So,
right.
When I was 21 years old and going to school at University of Houston, I got my first job in inside sales at an oil field company and never looked back from there. So since then, it's just been oil and gas my whole career.
Yeah, even one of the teams, is it the NFL team called the Houston Oilers?
Yeah, so the Houston Oilers, they moved to Tennessee. Now we've got the Houston Texans, but there's
right.
It's very much an oil focused state. I mean, that drives the economy, it drives everything.
Yeah, interesting. So let's talk about some of that oil trading experience. Like you said, you've been doing that for a number of years or decades even. So how did you get into that? How did that get started?
So that's a good question. It's actually kind of a crazy story. A guy that was a mentor of mine in my young 20s, I ran into him years later, and he was working at a trading desk. I ran into him at a bar randomly in Houston, and so we had a real good relationship. He taught me a lot of stuff in my young 20s, and so I had an opportunity, and I got hired by him. Passed my Series 3 exam and never looked back. So I was crude oil broker and a trader. So I would facilitate trades between Shell, Anadarko, Chevron, Exxon. So what these guys do is they'll trade in the crude oil markets, hedging their physical deliveries at the refineries. So, a company like Shell or Chevron, they've got to refine a certain amount of oil. And so they buy it to take physical delivery on, but they're going to hedge their place in the market, against price swings. So I would, as a broker, facilitate trades, I'd have a big tower at my desk, I'd push a button speaking, "Hey, Nancy at Shell, this is going to be plus 225 WTI to Mars," that sort of thing. So that was really interesting. But the interesting story about the whole thing, how I got out of it. So in 2014 or 2016, when the price of oil dropped below $30 a barrel.
Right.
So the trading desk I was at actually was owned by a holding company out of New Hampshire. So we came in on a Wednesday morning to go to work, and oil dropped below $30 a barrel. I mean, Houston was spinning, it was just chaos in the oil field at the time. And so our ownership group decided that night that they were going to close their energy portfolio altogether. So they sold all their wells that were in production in Oklahoma, closed our trading desk, just closed their whole energy portfolio altogether. So we came into work on a Wednesday, and we learned that our office was no longer existing on that Friday. So it was just everybody in the office grabbing chairs, computers, TVs. It was just a free for all for office equipment. But that's the cycle of the oil field.
Yeah, that must have been quite a wild time because yeah, like
Yeah.
there was a point where oil was more or less worthless. Like
Yeah, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was people were paying $30 a barrel not to take oil. It was a wild time.
crazy, crazy. And you mentioned a term there quickly, WTI, which correct me if I'm wrong, West Texas Intermediate.
Yep, yes, sir. So there's different grades and types of crude oil throughout the different basins in the country, right? And in Canada. So in Canada, you have a lot of Canadian heavy oil, heavy sands oil that comes out, and so there's sweet versus sour, heavy versus light. There's different types and grades of oil, and so West Texas Intermediate is a lighter, sweeter oil. So when it comes out of the ground, it has less sulfur content and it's a little bit easier to refine, which ironically, not a lot of people know this, but a lot of the WTI actually gets exported out of the United States because the United States refineries are set up to refine the heavier oil. And actually about 60% of all the oil that the United States imports is from Canada.
Right. So that brings me to another interesting point because I'm sure it's very similar in the US. Here in Canada, there's always been, the constant debate my entire lifetime of why are we importing oil when we have so much of our own?
That is a complicated answer, but it's more how your refiners are set up. So, for example, a lot of European or even Western Asian refiners will be set up more to do the WTI. So that's why, like here in the United States, we export a lot of that. And it's a matter of pricing. So whatever it costs them to extract that out of the, Western Canadian sands or the heavy sands might be a different price than what they can import it on. So it's a lot of dynamics that go into what percentage gets imported versus exported, and
Right.
Demand goes into it. So there's a lot of variables that go into it, but it's mainly because of how the infrastructure of the refineries were set up to begin with. So, like for example, a lot of the Gulf Coast refineries here were set up to do more heavier oil. So it's just that's probably the leading cause of what determines that.
Yeah, that's interesting because I never realized that the refineries were set up differently for the different types of oils, and so that makes sense. If Canada has this heavier grade of oil that you're talking about, and that's what your refineries are set up for, that it makes sense that the U.S. is buying oil from Canada.
Right. And it's usually at a discount to what WTI, since WTI requires less refining, it naturally trades at a premium to some of the cheaper oils out there. That requires less of a process to get the sulfur content out or whatever they're doing with that oil.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Like I'm learning here already, just in the
Good.
first 8 minutes of our discussion. I'm learning a lot already. This is great. So
I love it.
yeah. And then so like carrying on further from that, I guess like, you're talking about your trading career, and obviously this is called the Passive Income Podcast, but and I get it, not everything is passive income. And I guess just what are some of your thoughts or opinions on the best ways to make money in the oil and gas industry?
Sure. And Dave, I think that energy actually fits right in with passive income because energy stocks are notoriously good dividend payers. I mean,
Right.
what's a better passive income than steady, consistent dividends? And they're often high yield dividends. One thing that as investors, as traders, one of the core fundamentals is volatility breeds opportunity, right? I mean, that's core, economic principle. Volatility breeds opportunity. And few sectors are more volatile than the oil and gas industry. So I think that there's always a lot of opportunity in the space. I think that energy is a really good sector to be in because it has a larger capital upside along with a steady dividend pay. So, like a lot of, like, for example, I'll just throw out Energy Transfer. So it's a massive midstream company. Infrastructure, thousands and thousands of miles of pipeline. I mean, it's mission critical to the world's oil and gas flow.
Right.
So a company like that, like it's trading around $13 a share right now. The downside risk for that, right? It's not gonna go. It might knock a couple dollars down in a crash, right? It's not exposed to volatility of commodity prices. So a company like that, it pays a very high dividend yield. I think it was like 8 point something percent last I saw. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to double check, but
Yeah.
it's a high dividend stock, and it goes. So if there's a Lake Charles project, they're building out an export facility in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and if that gets some final investment decision, you're looking at 50% upside capital with the continued safe dividend. So the point being is that if you understand the industry, and that's what I'm kind of trying to accomplish here, is enlighten more people about how the energy works, so you can identify, your own winners and figure out what to do from there. But energy, it's a predictable volatility, is if that makes sense. So yes, there's a cyclical nature of the oil field. It goes up, it goes down. But if you understand the supply and demand dynamics and the variables like the geopolitics, weather, et cetera, if you kind of understand the core fundamentals, that it really is a predictive volatility, cyclicalness that you can get ahead of. So that's one of my main goals in writing the book and doing these podcasts and getting my message out there, is like there is a great opportunity as a passive income, as an active income, as
Right.
trading. Like there's a lot of opportunity, and it gets a lot of negative stigma. So trying to push past that barrier of oil and gas is volatile. No, I'm not touching that. There's a lot of opportunity for investors out there, and not enough people know about that.
Yeah, interesting. So you mentioned a couple companies there, and if you had to pick one to invest in, like I think you mentioned Shell and Chevron, and then on top of that, there's obviously BP, British Petroleum, Imperial Oil, kind of the list goes on. Um,
Yep.
if you had to pick one company, which one would you pick to invest in right now?
Energy transfer, ET, NASDAQ ET, or New York Stock Exchange ET. I love energy transfer. I am so bullish on that company. It's, like I mentioned, it's got a 50% plus capital upside. So the biggest thing right now is the Department of Energy denied their export extension, their extension on their export license. So they're investing a huge amount of money into this facility in Lake Charles, Louisiana. So this facility they're turning into a liquid natural gas export facility, which since the Russia-Ukraine conflict going on, there's been a huge natural gas supply void that was supplied by Russia to Europe. Now the United States is exporting natural gas like crazy, which is awesome for us. So
Right.
there's a huge supply void left in Europe and across the world with this, and the United States has stepped up big time. So this project in Lake Charles, Louisiana, it makes too much sense on way too grand of a scale for the entire United States, for energy security, for the shale industry. It's widely, from everybody I've talked to in the industry and all my colleagues, it's inevitable that it's going to go through. So the market has not yet priced into the share value of Energy Transfer this project. I believe that once this Lake Charles facility gets final investment decision, and like they've been working with the DOE to expedite a new permit, and like all signs are positive coming out. So when that goes through, I believe you're going to see a sharp increase in the price, and investors are going to be very happy when that happens.
DOE, is that Department of Environment in the U.S.?
Department of Energy. Sorry.
Department of Energy. Sorry.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So Energy Transfer is another very, very, very popular one among the DivX community.
Yep.
I see a lot of tweets, posts about it, and so I can definitely see why you're on board with that. From my limited knowledge of it, of just more or less what I've read on Twitter, right, or on X,
Sure.
whatever we're calling it. And just to your point too about LNG, liquefied natural gas, kind of similar projects here in Canada where we're building pipelines from Alberta to the coast to be able to export that towards towards the Asian markets.
Yep.
Great conversation earlier, well, several episodes now ago with Lindsay. Definitely, I'll link that one in the description as well. She was very knowledgeable on what was going on in Canada with the LNG projects. So
Nice. I'd definitely love to learn more about that. Yeah, the pipeline projects are absolutely necessary across both Canada and the United States. I know there's pipelines get a bad rap. They're without a doubt not even close. It's comparable. They're the safest way to transport any kind of hydrocarbon. I mean, they have
right,
safety shut off lines. Pipelines are necessary, and I'm not going an environmental. I don't want to create a controversy on your podcast, but it's important because it connects the markets, right? So, like Western Canada can now get their natural gas to the East Coast to export over easily to Europe. Like it's very important. The middle part of Texas and Oklahoma need to be able to get to the East Coast to different refineries and export docks. So it is
right.
important to have that infrastructure built out for taking advantage of the energy that your country has.
Yeah, and you also mentioned sort of the dynamics of what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, and I'm just kind of, if you wouldn't mind sort of expanding on that as well, because all these sanctions against Russia, and now 2 years later we kind of find out, well, Russia's just selling all of that to China and India, and then they're selling it back to Europe at a premium, and so Europe is just kind of caught in the middle of like paying higher prices for all of their energy needs.
So Europe's almost like the child and the divorced parents that are stuck in the middle, getting the brunt of all the fight, the bickering between everybody else in the world. So yeah, so the natural gas is a huge thing, that the supply void in Russia. So those sanctions did allow American shale producers to kind of take advantage of more of a export market share. But when it comes to the oil side of things, man, these sanctions hurt us more than it helps us realistically for our economic benefit from oil. So
Right.
yeah, like Russia's absolutely skirting sanctions, selling it directly to India, directly to China, who, like you said, are absolutely turning it on a premium, selling it to Europe.
Or
But
whoever else, Australia probably, or whoever,
uh,
I don't know.
everywhere, yeah, absolutely. It's more the BRICS nations that are kind of working together to buy Russian oil. I will say this, so OPEC production cuts, right? Like that's been all over the news. Everybody's talked about that for years. That's nothing new.
Right.
So uh, for the first time maybe in history, OPEC is actually working together with less infighting and less betrayal, and all of these production cuts are actually happening for probably the first time in history. So Russia has committed to those production cuts, and it's being shown that they're actually doing that. So that's good for now, but at what time Iran is about to bring more oil into the market. Venezuela is about to bring more oil into the market. So it remains to be seen if OPEC is going to put up with the United States finding other sources of oil and what they're going to do. So I wish I had a good prediction of that right now, but this is
Right.
all playing out in real time. So it's going to be interesting to see how OPEC responds because Iran is part of that group as well. So, I know the United States is talking about lifting off sanctions. And if that happens, we're going to see, $70 a barrel pretty soon. So we'll see how it plays out here in the next few days. It'll be interesting for sure.
Yeah, you brought up a couple of great points there. First, I have to correct myself. Just in the past episode of the Passive Income Podcast, we were talking about the BRICS economy, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and I believe the S is actually South America, where in the last
Yep.
episode I said Saudi Arabia. So I'm just backtracking and
So
correcting myself on that one.
well, you're not entirely wrong, actually. In this last BRICS meeting, they invited Saudi Arabia and Iraq, I want to say. Saudi Arabia and Iraq, they just formally gave an invite. The BRICS nations gave an invite to them. Saudi Arabia is going back to discuss it internally, and they're going to let them know. I saw that just a couple days ago.
So maybe I was a little bit correct, but not entirely wrong.
I'll give you credit for it.
And then you also mentioned Venezuela in there, which is a very, very interesting country to discuss simply because they have some of the greatest natural resources in the world, and yet they don't seem to know what they're doing with it because they have also one of the worst economies in the world somehow. I really don't get how that math works.
Yeah, so it's a state-owned oil company, and it has been a state funneled money laundering, getting everything you can out of it as whoever's in charge at that time, politician-wise.
Right.
They're
So the word you're looking for is
politically
corruption.
100% corruption. I mean, their socialism policies that are they can't follow through on a single policy because they're not around long enough to see anything work. So it's Venezuela's in complete chaos economically, politically, but like you said, they have abundant natural resources. So
Yeah, beyond oil and gas, like
oh,
tons of all
lot,
sorts of other natural resources, and
yep, lots of
and
minerals.
somehow
Absolutely.
yeah, and somehow they just have like the worst inflation in the world and literally one of the worst economies, and it's unfortunate for the actual people of
Oh my gosh,
Venezuela that
absolutely.
they
Being
could
in
be living
Houston,
a really
I've
good
had a
life.
lot of Venezuelan friends over the years, and it's. I mean, you get down to it, it's kind of sad, you know, how the people suffer from all the corruption and manipulation of the currency and the oil, and
Right.
it's not a good situation. But you know, hopefully someday they can get some stuff figured out there.
I am kind of curious, beyond oil and gas in your investing portfolio, do you have any other sectors that you like or that you invest in?
So right now, I did have Apple, but I got rid of it at what was it, 185, like a couple weeks ago, a few weeks ago. Apple was the last holdout I had. Now, and trust me, I know as an investor, it's not good to have all your exposure in one sector. But right now, as it stands, I unfortunately do have all my exposure in the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, it might be a good idea to look at some diversification there in
Yeah,
something,
you're
anything.
100% right. You know, what's ironic is just yesterday I was looking through everything and I kind of came to that realization like, oh my goodness. But for me, though, too, it's I trust myself and my knowledge and my experience of the oil and gas. Those are my most confident investments because of my background and what I know. So
Right.
it,
Which
it
makes sense.
wasn't it wasn't a matter of like this is what I'm going to do. It's a matter of all the the closeouts, the new positions, whatever it's been, has just happened to be energy specific, just because that's what I'm most confident about. So
So, what others, for the purpose of diversification and just for a fun conversation here, what would be the another sector that you would look at right now?
So agriculture is the other thing that I'm pretty into and knowledgeable on. I actually grew up on a farm in Iowa, and my dad still farms 600 acres of corn and soybeans. So I'm very knowledgeable on agriculture. So like, companies like John Deere or seed companies, fertilizer companies, because fertilizer, honestly, it goes back to oil and gas as well. So I have an understanding of the best of both worlds, agriculture and oil and gas,
Right.
So agriculture is without a doubt the second one that I'm most interested in and know most about. So Monsanto, Pioneer, Waffles, there's a lot of different agriculture seed companies, and I mean, John Deere is always I think John Deere is a pretty steady dividend paying stock if
Yeah, it sure
I'm
is.
not mistaken.
Interesting. So you're very well versed in the commodities, basically.
Yes, I'm a very much commodity based guy. I mean, that's my background.
So here's something I'm going to say that has never been said in 103 episodes plus several live streams of the Passive Income podcast. Chicago Mercantile Exchange. What are your thoughts on like, because that's very much like, here we talk so much about the New York Stock Exchange, the Toronto Stock Exchange, the S&P 500, the Nasdaq, and obviously Chicago is very commodity based.
Yep.
So I guess just what are your thoughts on the opportunity there maybe?
So you've got two main markets, right? The CME, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and the NYMEX, New York Mercantile Exchange as well. You can trade commodities off, either exchange or through either platform. Most of the stuff we always did in crude was CME based, but I also had plenty of people that worked off the NYMEX as well. So I think commodities are more dangerous for investors, traders, but also if you know what if you have not even the education, if you have the knowledge and have done the research, I think they are more predictable. I mean, obviously nothing's a sure bet, but I think commodities are probably a little more predictable because it's such a supply and demand is what drives that, versus there's so many variables in earnings reports and quantitative measures that you can do for individual stocks, individual companies. But commodities are such a supply and demand. Like that's really it, right? Like here's the variables, right? So geopolitics affect this. Well, it's only affecting supply and demand. It's not affecting the bottom line, the dividend growth. It's not affecting, quantitative measures. Like, I think that it's more dangerous. It's more volatile, but it's more predictable, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, when you go back to the commodities, you mentioned Iowa and cash crops, and you basically know, okay, we had a bumper crop this year, supply's high, price is probably gonna go down, whereas vice versa. Oh, it was a drought year, there was no rain, the crops didn't grow,
Right.
and the price is gonna go up, right? Like
And going back to our previous example, like the Russian-Ukraine war, like Ukraine is a huge wheat supplier. I mean, they do a lot of grain, so you can see geopolitical factors like that. That's how it affect the wheat prices are through the roof since that.
right.
So Brazil has a major drought. Brazil's a major corn producer, so corn prices will go down. Or China, the demand isn't going to be there this year, so prices will go down. Or God, they're buying all the corn that we got. So it's very much so. It's just so core at its core, supply and demand driven. That's what interests me a lot, and that's kind of why I've always focused on commodities.
Interesting. And I love that you just mentioned corn there, because there's a little bit of a crossover that obviously it's a food product, but the byproduct of ethanol going right back to to the
Absolutely.
earth, right?
So, and with all the more energy, green energy mandates, renewable energy mandates, climate change mandates coming across, both governmental and corporate guidance from all these companies. There's been actually Valero just built 30 miles away from my dad's farm a brand new ethanol facility right there in Iowa. They're buying up every local farmer's corn at a 5-cent premium to bringing it to the local co-op or the grain elevator. So I don't believe that. Look, it's great for people like my dad and the farmers in the Iowa and the people like that, but ethanol and all these biodiesels and renewable energy, greener energies, like there's biodiesel, renewable diesel, there's all these different biofuel products, right? And while it's great for stimulating economies, is that the answer? No. I mean, it's not more efficient, it's not more cost effective, it's not better performance, but it's helping other industries, and it's good as a whole, but it's not the future. It's not the answer or solution for energy in our world.
Do you feel there's a little bit of greenwashing in there with biodiesel and ethanol and everything?
So what a lot of people don't understand here, I'm glad you asked that. So all these carbon initiatives that these oil companies are doing, right? So like Valero wants to build a pipeline across Iowa it's a carbon pipeline. So they're going to take the carbon that they extract out of the ethanol, like when they're doing the ethanol process, they'll take the carbon out of when they're refining it, right? So they take the carbon out and they're going to pump it back down into the ground. Great. So that's fantastic, but what is that really doing to help us? Not a darn thing, right? So what they're doing is they're gaining tax credits by doing these kinds of things, these renewable diesel programs, these biofuel programs, all these green energy initiatives. Chevron and Exxon aren't setting up offshore wind farms because they work, because it's profitable, because it makes sense. They're doing it to get their emissions goals in line. So they might get these Section 2 emissions credits for the wind farm that they apply to their natural gas well. So now they're meeting the government standards on this natural gas well because of this offshore wind farm they just got credit for, not because it's doing the world good. It's because they got a tax credit and a carbon credit for. So don't get me wrong. Is fossil fuel the solution for mankind? Absolutely not, right? Like someday we'll have zero propulsion energy, sustainable, renewable energy. But that day's not here. And it's not going to be here in the next 100 years. Do you know how many products are made with oil and gas? I probably shouldn't have, but got into a little X or Twitter argument, with some climate person about it. Just doesn't make so the products we use in our everyday life in oil and gas, it's more than you can have any idea of. More than, we don't have enough time for me to list them all.
No,
from
like all the plastics and.
I mean, the plastics, the Tupperwares, the Ziplocs, I'm looking around on my desk and all these, my clipboard, my headphones, everything. And I told this climate change person, like, you couldn't even take that aspirin for your insufferable headache that you get from your insufferable self because without oil and gas, So like even down to the pill of aspirin that you're going to take, it's made with oil and gas. So the thought and the call to end fossil fuel, it's not just silly, it's ignorant. I'm all for reduce, reuse, recycle. Like we only get one planet, like I'm all
for now until Elon gets us another one.
Well, it's let's go Elon. But it's just not realistic. So I believe let's put our energy into solutions. Like let's actually find a solution. Let's not just say end fossil fuel, just stop oil. Like
you can't.
It's counterproductive, guys.
Yeah. Just ending, like if all the oil drilling in the world stopped today or tomorrow, that just wouldn't work, right?
We'd be a third world. I mean,
yeah.
It would be absolutely silly, And the electric car mandate, I mean, again, I'm all for positive change in our lives. California already has rolling blackouts. ERCOT, the Texas grid, is already asking people on hot days to conserve so that nobody has to do rolling brownouts. Like, where is this extra power going to come from for all these electric mandates? And furthermore, where do people think that electricity comes from? I mean, it's mainly natural gas and coal and oil.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot of hydroelectric actually here in Canada, but we also have nuclear power plants. So there are other alternatives, but so going back to what you just mentioned about EVs, electric cars, and what I had said about greenwashing, and I'm on board with you 100% too. I'm all for positive change, but I'm looking at electric vehicles going. It's a lot of mining lithium for all those batteries. It's a lot of mining copper for all those batteries. It's a lot of oil and gas for all the plastic that's in those vehicles, right? So,
yep. I mean, Dave, I could not have said it better. Thank you so much. Like perfectly said. Like it's illogical. That's my problem with it. Is it's illogical. If you like, I am all for solutions. Like let's solve a problem, but just crying for change. Illogical mandates. That's not the path forward. That's not how we're going to solve anything in our countries, our worlds, like ever.
Yeah. I mean, I just keep coming back to that one about the mining of the lithium, the mining of the copper, and actually, I hadn't even thought about like I'm sure there's got to be a lot of plastic in those cars too, like the dashboards and whatever else plastic is in there that's coming from
absolutely
fossil fuels, right? So.
And those electric cars are made with PET plastic, PET. It's like non-recyclable, can never be melted. It's a mixed grade of different polyethylenes, polypropylenes, which is hydrocarbons, but it's a mixture of different types of plastic, which is the worst kind because you can't melt it down at a common melting point. So it's not reusable. All cars are made with PET. Like it's start there. Start with logical changes. If they made it all polypropylene or all polyethylene, you can melt those down at a certain point and reuse the plastic. I mean,
Right.
There's so many other ways to increase our environmental or decrease our environmental footprint,
Right.
and ending fossil fuels is not the start, you know?
So another thing I wanted to, ask or bring up
Sure.
is, where do you see fossil fuels in 100, 150, 200 years? Because yeah, I agree with you. They're not going away anytime soon, but are we going to get to that point? Or you even mentioned like zero propulsion at some point in the future, or who knows what kind of advanced Star Trek type
So
technology we'll have in
we could get into the hypothetical of, I don't know how much you follow UFO phenomenon and that kind of culture, but there's arguments to be had that this electromagnetic these devices that cause gravitational bends around the object, so they're infinite energy devices. But that's a whole other
yeah,
podcast hypothetical there. So realistically, we have so much infrastructure for oil and gas in this world, right? Like, just think about the billions or trillions, probably globally, of miles of pipeline, all these refinery plants, gathering, treating, processing. There
the
are
ports too.
trillions.
If I'm sorry to interrupt, but if I'm not mistaken, like the ports for importing and export, like to ship something on a container or on a ship from the US to Europe or from Canada to Asia or wherever, the ports have to be set up for that as well. That's part of that infrastructure as well.
100%.
And yeah, it's definitely in the trillions of dollars. We're past the billions at this point.
Oh God, like trillions of dollars of oil and gas infrastructure. So how do and the amount of products made from oil and gas. So those two things right there tells you it's not going anywhere anytime soon. The transition to green renewable energy, it's not a freaking 20-year process. It's not a 10-year process. It is a 100-year process.
Minimum,
Think about
if not
all the
200, right?
products. It's not fathomable to have these net zero by 2030, 2050. Like, you can't just arbitrarily throw a number out on it. Like, I'd like to be rich by next Thursday. Let's do it. Like, come on. So it's not realistic, and it's a methodical process that's just going to have to take time over a number of years, right? And it's a 100-year process.
Minimum, if not 150, 200, 250 years.
Absolutely. It's minimum. I mean, then what do you do with all that infrastructure? You just tear it down? Like, no, you got to have a plan in place. You can't, what would happen to global economies if you stopped energy right now? I mean, good God, you want to talk about World War III? Let's just everybody push the nuke button right now, because like that world economies are driven by energy. It would throw the economy in an upheaval. I don't even know how you would predict riots, chaos of no level we've seen before if energy wasn't the driving factor right now. So energy is here to stay. Oil and gas is here to stay in our lifetimes, probably our kids' lifetimes, probably their kids' lifetimes. Is that to say we shouldn't try to find an alternative? I know, absolutely. Let's. I'm all for it. Like, anything that can better us as human beings, like, I'm all for. Like, let's be the best versions of ourselves we can be, but let's not be morons and ignorant about how we're going to do it. Is my biggest thing.
And I think what we need to find in the future is a way to repurpose, retrofit, renovate all this infrastructure for whatever comes next. So you're not just tearing down trillions of dollars worth and throwing it into a landfill. You've got to somehow figure out a way to still make it useful and purposeful.
Absolutely. Maybe you retrofit the pipelines to transfer water for irrigation to different parts of the country now, or, there's a million different ideas or things you could do with it. You've got to plan it out. It's not a smooth, let's
not an
overnight
Thursday
and call it good.
Exactly. It's not, well, we'll have this done by Thursday. Like, okay, make sure it's on the boss's desk by Friday morning.
Exactly.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I wish it did, but yeah, no, that's not. It's not reality.
So we have spoke a little bit about renewables and, like you mentioned, the offshore wind farms, and we have quite a few. I've even in the past worked on them myself. Solar farms here in Canada. So you'll have like take 100-acre field or even larger, 500 acres, and just put up rows on rows on rows on end of solar panels. And again, is it helping? Hopefully, yes. Is it creating more energy? For sure. Um, is it lowering my electric bill? No, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And same, we have quite a few, windmills in sort of various locations around the country as well. And I guess I'm just sort of asking, what are your thoughts on the renewables of solar and wind, particular as of right now, 2023?
As of right now, today, we're doing so much more harm than good implementing all these solar and wind farms. Onshore wind farms, less damage. Offshore wind farms are absolutely horrible. If you read any of the reports, like actual non politicized environmental impact studies that are on these offshore wind farms and the whales, I mean, like, I'm not Greenpeace over here, save the whales, but like, I mean, holy cow, how are you just going to ignore something so blatant and negative for wildlife? Like, come on, it's having a huge detrimental effect to whales all across the globe because of the pounding of the offshore wind farms, the pounding underneath the water, the decibels. It's like they were comparing it to somebody hitting a bass drum right next to your ear, just over and over. That's what the whales are feeling. So, offshore wind farms are absolutely horrible. And then, I mean, I think we all know now, the solar panels, how are they made? They're made with lithium. How is lithium mined? With child labor. I mean,
Yeah.
it's terrible. Like the idea, solar technology has come a long way in the last 5-10 years. I'll give them that. I mean, the battery storage and the ability to make it more efficient, that's come a little ways, but it still doesn't help when it's child labor's forced slavery that's creating the lithium that goes, or that's even manufacturing them. I mean,
Right.
hell, China manufactures most of them. So I believe the idea is it's coming from a good place, but it's one of those things where, okay, well, we have this goal, so we're going to just turn a blind eye that way and not
Mhm.
see any of the bad stuff going on because solar. So it's not the future, it's not realistic, and it's doing more harm than good, whether people want to admit that or accept that or not. I mean, those are the facts of the situation.
Right. And when you dig deeper into how the solar panels are made, also not just the lithium, but more byproducts from oil and gas again, right?
Oh, yep. Yep.
And then, like I said, working on these solar farms too, it would be say a year-long project, and you'd have all these excavators and heavy machinery and bulldozers and skid steers and rock trucks and all of them all burning diesel all day long.
They're not running on electricity.
So I and I mean, again, sure, if it's say a 1 year build or even 18 months to build a very large solar farm, and so you're burning that diesel for a year, and then you've got another, say, 20 or 30 years of life out of all of these solar panels. And then at that point, 30 years down the road, or less, 15, 20 years down the road, you have to start replacing these solar panels again, right? So
So, at what point is it truly net positive for the environment?
right, yeah, yeah. I don't know the answer to that question. And
That makes two of us.
right. Oh, wow, this has been a very enjoyable conversation.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. Like I said, I've learned a lot here. Just right from the get go, educating me on so much of the oil and gas. Obviously, there's so much that we kind of know just because it is so big in our everyday lives, right? Whether it's just
Right.
filling up your car that's not electric, or my house. In the winter, I use propane to heat my house, and
Yep.
it's just sort of endless of what what we use the oil and gas industry and that energy for. Um, Shout out to Energy Transfer for being a top pick among yourself and so many others on Dividend Twitter. I do have to though quickly ask before we sign off. You're from Texas. You grew up in Iowa. Why are you wearing a Red Sox jersey?
I am a diehard Red Sox fan, man. Since I was a little kid, so my grandfather was a veteran, fought in World War II, and so I used to when I was a kid growing up, I used to sit on his lap, and he was a big Ted Williams fan because Ted Williams took off the prime of his career to go be a fighter pilot in World War II. So my grandfather made me essentially a Ted Williams fan, and so I used to sit on his lap, watch Roger Clemens. We used to VHS tape record anytime the Red Sox played nationally. I'd watch Roger Clemens tapes over and over and over again. I had Roger Clemens jerseys. All my numbers in sports were 21 because of him and the Red Sox. And so since the day I was born, man, I'm a Red Sox fan through and through. So been to Boston a bunch of times, been to Fenway a bunch of times.
Yeah, that picture is at Fenway Park, correct?
It's truly, when you walk in that stadium, you just get goosebumps everywhere. I don't care if you're a Red Sox fan. Like even my buddy from Houston, he got goosebumps everywhere. Yeah. It's the history. It's the Holy Cathedral. You know, it is just beautiful. The green monster standing there. That picture right there. I'm standing in left field by the monster on the Carlton Fisk foul pole. So I could talk romantically about Fenway Park all day long, brother.
Nice. Shout out to Roger Clemens, too, who also played for my favorite team, the Blue Jays, for a number of years as well. So,
absolutely. You know, fun fact, my grandfather, he was a farmer in Iowa. He ended up getting a house in Fort Myers, Florida during the winter in his later years and actually played golf with Roger Clemens at a Pro-Am in Fort Myers, Florida one year. So it's had that picture of them shaking hands when I was growing up too. So that was kind of cool.
All right. You can find Brian on Twitter or on X, the app formerly known as Twitter, at bfrye, Frye, at bfrye21. Be sure to give Brian a follow over there. And Brian, before we do sign off, any final thoughts or?
Yeah, I want to say, hey, thank you for having me on. Like, I follow a lot of your content, Dave. You do a great job, man. Always enjoy seeing your stuff, quality stuff, A+. I love the podcast, man. Since we kind of started interacting, I went back and looked at some of your podcasts and love what you're doing, brother. Love what you're doing. Keep it up, man. Thank you for letting me talk about oil and gas. You know, I feel like I don't get to rant enough some of my opinions. And you know, there's so many misconceptions out there in oil and gas that it's important for people to know the facts and the reality. And the oil and gas industry is so incredibly complicated, right? There's markets within markets within markets. Like the complexity goes on and on. So I appreciate you giving me the time and the platform to, you know, kind of share some insights on how the industry works. And I highly encourage your listeners, your followers, check out some energy stocks. You know, they're high paying dividends, steady dividends a lot of times. And over the last 5 years, there's been a huge shift within the industry to focus on a better balance sheet, free cash flow. Like really, they have been doing a higher prioritizing shareholder returns and shareholder value. So you're seeing a lot more stock buybacks within the industry, and highly encourage people to give oil and gas and the energy sector a good look around. And if you want some analysis, you know, give me a follow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and right off the top, you mentioned like upstream, downstream, midstream, and we didn't even really get into too much of an explanation on that. So when your book comes out, we'll have you come back to promote the book, and we'll have another discussion about oil and gas and commodities, and maybe by then you've diversified into maybe one more sector after that.
I swear I do. Yeah, well, you know what? That just means I'm gonna have to follow you for some tips here.
Nice. Awesome. Again, thank you so much for coming on and spending some time with me. Truly appreciate having you as a guest on the Passive Income Podcast. If you're still here 50 minutes later, please just go ahead and hit subscribe.